Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships. Just a little reminder, if you haven't been listening, please do go check out my new podcast, Navigating Narcissism. You can listen to it and subscribe at iHeart or anywhere you get your podcast. You can get the info on that in the video notes. Kind of an interesting approach to narcissism. But in this next video, taking on something interesting, and it's in response to some questions that someone sent in, which is, so you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person and they go to therapy. What happens next? I'd love for you to also drop in the comments. Has that happened? You've been in a relationship with a narcissistic person and they go to therapy. Here's all I have to say about this. Be careful what you ask for. We know that in general, when narcissistic folks go to therapy, the research shows they're more likely to drop out prematurely, or at the moment when a therapist wants them to go deep emotionally, or be accountable, or take responsibility. That's when they try to cut bait. But the fact is, more than a few narcissistic folks go to therapy, especially people who are vulnerable or what are sometimes called covert narcissists, because they're also more likely to have issues like anxiety, depression, the stuff that typically gets folks into therapy. So you're in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic, they go to therapy. I'm sure you were thinking, isn't it good that they're going into therapy? Maybe there is hope. Maybe they will start unpacking their stuff and working on empathy and compassion, and it'll just be better. It's a long shot, especially if the person has moderate to severe narcissistic patterns, but unicorns sometimes happen. But it is a long shot that you're going to see any change that's meaningful to you in a relationship. But there's a bigger issue here. A bigger problem is that if you're in a relationship with somebody narcissistic and they go to therapy, they may quite often play a different kind of game. So let me sort of lay this out as a scenario, as a means of showing it to you. You are in a relationship with a narcissistic person. After much hemming and hawing, they actually end up going to therapy. They go to therapy. They go for a few sessions, more than a few sessions, maybe even a few months. And then they report back and tell you that their therapist said that they're not the problem, but in fact that it's you that's the problem. That they told the therapist about the things that you're doing in the relationship. I don't know, for example, maybe you tried to set a boundary. And then the narcissistic person will come home from therapy and they'll say, you know what? My therapist said that you're being controlling. They may also say that my therapist said that you have to recognize that when I raise my voice, it's my trauma talking, and that at those times you need to be present with me and hug me and love me like my parent didn't. Now, to say that when they come home and say that stuff to you is a mind F is an understatement. Now, if you're not a therapist, which most people aren't, you may even think that the narcissistic person is coming home from therapy and telling the truth. That maybe their therapist does think that you're controlling, or that you are supposed to be their mommy and love them better. And many survivors are already doing that to themselves. But to hear that their therapist may be suggesting that, that can make things even worse. I can tell you this, in most cases, a therapist is not telling their client that someone setting boundaries is controlling, or that the other person in the relationship should have to endure verbal abuse. Now, sadly, I say most cases because some therapists may not get it right, but in most cases they do. However, therapy is also garbage in, garbage out. If the client is telling us things that are not true, or are exaggerations or are distortions, our position is to believe the client. So if the client is telling the therapist untruths about things that the other person in the relationship is doing, it's quite conceivable that the therapist may not view the other person in the best light. The challenge here is that if the narcissistic person does this, they tell you that their therapist is saying all this stuff and it works. For example, maybe you start becoming looser with your boundaries, or you actually do give them a big hug when they yell at you. I can promise you this, they're going to keep doing it and telling you more therapist nonsense. For any of us in a narcissistic relationship, the key issue is that we recognize that abuse is abuse, and that it isn't your responsibility to hug someone when they yell at you or excuse their bad behavior on the basis of their sad backstory. It is an adult's responsibility to get their own house in order and find ways of responding that are not frightening or abusive. So no matter what tidbits your narcissistic partner may come home from therapy with, the key is to recognize that it's not the therapist's role to necessarily weigh in on the behavior you need to change, so you can maintain your boundaries as you usually do. So all of that said, because most survivors of narcissistic abuse, whether it's past abuse or abuse that's happening right now in real time, most survivors tend to blame themselves for what's happening in the relationship. They question themselves, they internalize the gaslighting, and they live in self-doubt. And many survivors are also quite grateful when the narcissistic person in their lives goes to therapy, and they want to support it. So when the narcissistic person comes home from therapy with feedback, suggestions, or direction, it can play upon your existing self-blame and confusion. And people in these relationships may find themselves doubting themselves even more, or even wondering if they are actually the problem, since the narcissistic person's therapist, according to the narcissistic person, is saying that they are. You're never going to find out the truth of what their therapist said, because therapy is confidential and their therapist isn't going to talk to you. So basically, the narcissistic person can come home and say whatever they want about what their therapist is saying. Here's the deal. If you aren't seeing substantive shifts in the narcissistic person's behavior, more empathy, more accountability, more self-awareness, more compassion, then whatever is happening in that therapy room is happening, but it sure as hell isn't resulting in meaningful change on your side. When I say that, your side, it isn't resulting in meaningful change on what you're seeing. Now, most people aren't therapists, and they believe that when a person comes home from therapy and says that the therapist is giving suggestions, they may not understand that a therapist is not going to make absurd suggestions to someone who is not their client. So I'm here to tell you that does not happen. So if somebody comes home and says, my therapist says you have to be nicer to me, it's probably not what they're saying. Be very wary when a narcissistic person rolls up to you and says, my therapist says you are this, or my therapist says you need to do that. In almost all cases, it's likely a distortion of something the therapist said, and it could be an attempt to weaponize their own therapy, capitalize on your empathy, and manipulate a situation further to their advantage. Listen, the proof is in the behavioral pudding. If you aren't seeing behavioral change, but are instead being told that you're a bad person, I can tell you one thing about their therapy: it ain't working. Somebody actually sent this suggestion in, so I'd like to thank that person. And they cleverly called this whole process, they called it narcissistic telephone, which I thought was actually quite an interesting way to put it. I really welcome the many ideas that people send in. I really enjoy doing the research on them and doing the deeper dives to further explain this. But like I said, next time the narcissistic person who's in therapy, it may not even be a partner, it may be a family member, they roll up to you and says, hey, my therapist said you're a bad person, I'm guessing that's not what they said. And so just take that with a grain of salt, and definitely don't receive it as an indictment on you. Thanks again.